Welcome back to the GCN Racing News Show. This week, after Roglic's win at the Dauphiné, Tadej Pogačar and Geraint Thomas have proven they're ready for the Tour de France with wins in Slovenia and Switzerland respectively. But how much has it really told us about their form? I'll also be looking back at the controversial final stage of the Tour of Belgium, an important win for Israel Premier Tick at the Route d'Occitanie, and the opening stages of the Women's Tour de Suisse. But I will start with the Men's Tour de Suisse, which kicked off really well. Andreas Leknesson took the biggest win of his career on stage 2, staying clear from the early breakaway. Unfortunately, Alberto Bettiol didn't realise there was anybody still up the road and put in an heroic celebration as he crossed the line for second place. Which made me wonder, what's worse, celebrating a win when there's still a rider up the road, or celebrating too early only for somebody else to pip you to the line? Let me know in the comments section down below. At least though, Bettiol had Matteo Trentin to console him afterwards. Stage 3 saw the return to form of Peter Sagan in true vintage Sagan style. He survived the climbs, nailed his positioning to perfection in the final kilometres before out-sprinting Christoph to the line. Now that was his first win in around 9 months, meaning he's now won at least one World Tour race every season for the last 13 years. And wasn't it great to see him back? Albeit briefly, because a couple of days later he was amongst a huge number of riders at the race to test positive for COVID-19, which was seemingly spreading like wildfire through the Switzerland peloton. Entire teams went home, Jumbo-Visma, Alpecin Phoenix and Bahrain Victorious amongst them, whilst Alexander Vlasov, who won stage 5 and took the overall lead, was never able to wear the leader's yellow jersey because he too had to abandon with a positive test. Now, there were so many cases at the race that there was speculation the whole thing would be cancelled, but it did continue, albeit with only half of the 153 starters actually making it to the last stage. And it's quite a worry for the Tour de France, isn't it? Firstly for the teams and the riders, who've not only lost out on some key preparation, but who also have to hope that some of their key riders are able to recover in time. But there's also the worry that the same thing could happen at the Tour de France. We might see some big name riders exit prematurely. That said, I can't think of a single rider who's tested positive for COVID-19 during an ASO event. I'm not entirely sure what to make of that, but it might bode well. Fingers crossed. Back to the riders that did remain within the race. Nico Dens and Thibaut Pinot won from the early breakaways on stages 6 and 7 respectively. But in the GC battle, there wasn't a lot to separate Jakob Fuglsang, Sergio Henao and Geraint Thomas on the main climbs. And it meant that just 19 seconds separated those three heading to the 25k individual time trial on the final day. Now, the odds were stacked in favour of Thomas, given his history in time trialling, and he didn't disappoint. In fact, he almost won the stage, finishing just 3 seconds behind Remco Evenepoel on a brand new prototype Pinarello Bolide disc brake equipped TT bike. Now, we don't have any details on that new bike just yet, or at least I don't, but given that Ineos had 2 of their 3 remaining riders on that new machine and both finished in the top 4, it certainly looks like it's pretty damn fast. I'm sure Ollie and Alex will have more information for you on the tech show this week if you'd like to find out more. On the day, Higuita finished 11th, which was just about enough for him to remain ahead of Fuglsang on GC by 4 seconds. And that's a decent amount of UCI points, though, in the bag for Israel Premier Tech, who not only finished 3rd on GC with Fuglsang, but also won a stage with Daryl Impey. The old guys are finally coming good for them, and another of their veterans was also busy ripping it up in another race that I will get onto shortly. For Thomas, well, he becomes the first ever British rider to win the Tour de Suisse, and that marks his 10th professional general classification win. And given that Danny Martinez didn't look on top form at the race, you'd imagine that Thomas will be one of their protected leaders for the Tour de France, particularly given the early time trial and cobbled stage at the race. Shout out too should go to Stefan Kung of Groupama FDJ, who seemed to have completely redefined himself as a rider this season. So after concentrating on the Spring Classics, in which he was impressively consistent, he's now turned himself into a GC rider. Now, whilst he may not have won the TT as he was aiming for, 5th on GC at such a big race when you're about 80 kilos is no mean feat. 4th was also a great result for Nielsen Powerless at EF Education Easy Post, even though he'd have loved to have been on the final podium, whilst it was also encouraging to see Bob Jungels back to some good form. He finished 5th in the final time trial and 6th on GC. On to the Tour of Slovenia now, which was basically the Tadej Pogačar show. It was like we had live coverage of his final training camp ahead of the Tour de France. He essentially gifted stage 1 to his teammate Rafał Majka, then he won stages 3 and 5, the GC and the points classification too. Now, it turns out that there is an Achilles heel to Tadej Pogačar. He's not very good at rock, paper, scissors. That's how he and Rafał Majka decided who was going to win on stage 4, with Pogačar solid as a rock, losing out to Majka, who looked good on paper. The only stage that ended up in a sprint was on day 2, where Dylan Groenewegen took a relatively comfortable victory over Tamino and Ackermann. So what have we learnt about the GC favourites for the Tour de France at this point? Well, we've learnt that they don't really like to race against each other very much, with Roglic, Thomas and Pogačar all choosing different paths towards Denmark. Roglic can be content with his form and that of his team. They dominated the Dauphiné. Thomas can be pleased that he's hitting form at just the right time. He looked really solid right now. Whilst I haven't learnt anything, I don't think, about Pogačar, anything less than a win at the Tour of Slovenia would have been unusual. Now, last year, he only won 1 stage of that race. This year, he took 2. So maybe he's going even better. Who knows? What I do know is that Pogačar has now won 8 of the last 9 stage races that he started, and that he has 10 wins from 24 days of racing in 2022. I mean, it's not just the Tour of Slovenia, which is a playground for him. It feels like the biggest races in the world are child's play for him. He will go into the Tour de France as the big favourite, but I just hope we get a good battle this year, right to the end. Meanwhile, at the Tour of Belgium, we had a few tough days of racing. Mads Pedersen won the opening day from a small group, but Jasper Philipsen got his own back 24 hours later by winning into Knokke Heist. Pedersen, though, maintained his lead in the GC in finishing second to Yves Lampaert on stage 3, which was an individual time trial. But the general classification had its biggest shake-up the following day. With Pedersen missing out on the day's key move, it meant Tim Wellens was the virtual race leader for much of the day. However, in finishing second to Wellens' third, Mauro Schmidt had done enough to put himself into the leader's jersey that day, the difference between them coming down to fractions of a second from the individual time trial. Quentin Hermans won that stage for Intermarché Wanty-Gobert, which propelled him 6 places up the GC into third. This is how he celebrated and cooled down afterwards.
Well, for our stage winner, this was the well-deserved reward.
And so it was all very tight going into the 5th and final stage, which made the Golden Kilometre crucial. Now, this is a stretch of 1 kilometre in which there are 3 intermediate sprints, all of which have 3, 2 and 1 bonus seconds for the first 3 riders across the lines. Quickstep were obviously quite happy to leave the early breakaway up the road to sweep up those bonus seconds, which meant that Lotto Soudal had to take full responsibility for chasing it down, which they did. And not only that, they gave Wellens a brilliant lead out into the first of those 3 sprints, where he took 3 bonus seconds and a virtual race lead. Florian Sénéchal then attacked immediately afterwards, which was a bit bizarre, because by that point, Schmidt needed to take as many bonus seconds as possible. And this is where it all got a little bit nasty. Yves Lampaert seemed more intent on hindering and blocking Wellens than he was on helping his own teammate, which I guess he still was doing in a slightly underhand way. By the end of that Golden Kilometre, they'd both picked up a total of 4 bonus seconds, and with neither placing in the top 3 at the finish, it meant that Schmidt was the overall winner. Fair play to him, he did nothing wrong himself, but it wasn't really the kind of racing that you want to be watching. I've got to say, though, that Wellens was remarkably calm and professional about the whole thing in his post-race interview.
It's pretty painful to lose the Tour of Belgium with so little. Everything went perfect. We did a perfect job today. In the first Bonnie sprint, I took 3 seconds. It was looking very good. Then had a small discussion with Lampaert before the second Bonnie sprint, and this cost me the victory in the Tour of Belgium. So yeah, I'm pretty disappointed, but I think we can say we did everything to try to win it.
Lampaert was later disqualified from the race, but that made no difference to the overall result. The UCI are only able to punish a rider for their actions and not the team. So you can effectively sacrifice a rider to take a rival out of the picture with no detrimental consequences to you. Now, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this incident, which you can leave in the comment section down below. Now, not only did they come away with the overall win on the day, Quickstep Alpha Vinyl, they also took the stage with Fabio Jakobsen. The team used a lot of energy throughout the Golden Kilometre, but the lack of lead-out train did not affect the Dutchman, who took a morale-boosting victory ahead of his first participation at the Tour de France. Now, there is a slight worry, I would say, for Sam Bennett, whose only win this year remains at Eschborn Frankfurt. The Irishman just didn't look capable of winning stage in Belgium, despite a brilliant lead out from his team on that 5th and final day. And it's going to be interesting to see what their game plan will be at the upcoming Tour de France. And there are now just 11 days until the Grand Depart in Copenhagen, Denmark, but we do have some more racing for you on GCN Plus before the start. This weekend we have live coverage of the national championships from 3 countries: the French, which has live coverage of the time trials and road races, the British, which has live coverage of the criteriums and road races, and the Spanish, which is just the road races on Saturday and Sunday. All of those races are available to watch in all GCN Plus territories. Beyond that, the Women's Tour de Suisse continues today and concludes tomorrow, when it will be the Queen stage, with a Category 1 climb midway through and then a summit finish to Lens at the finish. We'll also have the next episode of The World of Cycling out for you on Wednesday, where I'll be joined by 2 experts to give us their thoughts on the Tour de France form guide and the behaviour of Yves Lampaert in Belgium. Looking a little further ahead, the Tour de France starts next Friday, but ahead of that, we've got live coverage of the team's presentation on Wednesday the 29th of June, and the start of the Giro Donne from Friday the 30th of June, and that one is available in all territories. We will also be getting our big Tour de France preview for you soon as well, with the warm-up races now all done and dusted. Hoping we can get that up this weekend, but if not, it will be early next week. And then looking even further ahead than that, the UCI announced last week the dates for the second series of the UCI Track Champions League. The first round will once again be in Mallorca. That'll be on the 12th of November. 1 week later, they're in Berlin. Then it's on to Saint-Quentin in France before the grand finale in London over the weekend of the 2nd and 3rd of December. That makes it 5 rounds in total. We will once again have full coverage for you on GCN Plus. And beyond all of that, a quick plug for our latest book, The Complete Fan's Guide to Pro Cycling. It's been written by longtime cycling journalist Peter Cossins, and the book's got something for everybody, whether you've been a fan of the sport for decades or you're new to racing and just looking to learn about the various nuances of cycling. It's available now over at shop.globalcyclingnetworks.com, and if you buy one along with our limited edition yellow elite water bottle, you'll get a 10% discount on that bundle. Over to the roads of France now for the Route d'Occitanie, formerly the Route du Sud, a 4-day race with a bit of everything mixed in, including a stage of just 36 kilometres, which was much shortened because of the heat wave that much of Europe was experiencing. Now, the opening day went to plan for Groupama FDJ and Arnaud Démare, who seems to have retained his form from the Giro. He won there. Roger Adrier took the shortened stage and his first pro victory in the uphill sprint the following day for a Keep Kern farmer. But the big GC battle played out on stage 3. And that was where Mike Woods of Israel Premier Tech proved to be in a league of his own. He and Christian Rodriguez of Ineos Grenadiers had been at the head of the race, with Nairo Quintana unable to follow. Woods would go on to win the stage by over a minute. The 4th and final stage wasn't quite as simple as I'm sure he would have liked, though, with crosswind splitting the peloton. However, the Canadian safely made the front group to clinch his first ever overall victory in a stage race. On that final stage, a lead out from Ineos put Viviani in a great place at the finish, but he just didn't have the speed and would eventually fade to 4th. Now, he might have been 3rd had it not been for opening up a gap between himself and the barriers to his left, which allowed Nicolo Bonifacio space to get through and take the win. Woods took the GC, finishing safely in the front group, with a trio of Spaniards finishing behind him: Rodriguez, Jesus Herrada and Alejandro Valverde. The Women's Tour de Suisse commenced on Saturday evening with a short opening stage that created some surprisingly large time gaps given how short it was. Lucinda Brandt outsprinted her 2 breakaway companions at the finish, Clara Koppenberg and Pauline Royackers, to take the win and the first leader's jersey. However, in the following day's individual time trial, a scintillating performance from Team Bike Exchange's Christina Faulkner saw her overcome a disadvantage over a minute to put herself into the lead of the race. Now, the only other rider within a minute of her time was her teammate Georgia Williams in 2nd place, and they made it a clean sweep of the podium places, with Georgia Baker in 3rd. Brandt took 4th on that stage, and she must have been somewhat surprised that she'd lost the race lead after such a solid performance herself. But fair play to Faulkner, who averaged well over 48 kilometres per hour, 30 miles per hour, over the 26-kilometre race. Now, as I mentioned before, the race continues today and concludes tomorrow, so check it out live or on demand over on GCN+. Now, the other news around the Women's Tour de Suisse is that from next year, it will be a World Tour level event. On to some other news outside of the big pro races. Leo Hayter became the second British rider to win the Baby Giro 2 years after Tom Pidcock became the first. He's the brother of Ethan. Leo won back-to-back stages on days 2 and 3, then held his own in the latter part of the race, taking the overall win by over 2 minutes from Lennart van Eitveld of the Lotto Soudal under-23 squad. Hayter currently rides for the Hagens Berman Action team this year, but I dare say a lot of World Tour teams will be sniffing about and hoping to get his signature on a contract for next year. I've got to say, some of the stages were brutal at that race. On stage 3, for example, there was a 1-hour uphill neutralised section before an epic stage. Riley Pickrell was in the saddle for over 7 hours that day, with over 5,000 metres of climbing. And finally, Richard Carapaz is rumoured to be heading away from the Ineos Grenadiers team at the end of this year and over to EF Education Easy Post. And that would be a real coup for that squad. Right, that is all for this week's show. I'm off for a lie down after all that racing. It's tough being a cycling fan these days, isn't it? I will see you next week though.